Hello and welcome to Rob's Retro Reviews. I've recently reviewed all three of the original Spyro games in anticipation of the upcoming remake, and now, I'm happy to say that remake's finally out in the form of the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. So, I've gone to the trouble of getting 100% across all three games again, but this time in the remade form, in order to get the full experience and be able to put across my opinion to you. So, what is my opinion? Let's dive in and take a look, shall we? The Spyro Reignited Trilogy is a full-on remake of the original PS1 trilogy of games which were developed by Insomniac Games. Instead of the original developers coming back to create the Reignited Trilogy though, a studio called Toys for Bob took to the helm to create the remake. Toys for Bob are the studio responsible for the Skylanders series, so I guess it made sense for them to develop the remake, seeing as Skylanders Spyro's Adventure was the last game in the Spyro series before it faded away and became a dead franchise for a while. It's kinda like how the Rayman series disappeared for a while, and yet the spin-off title, Rayman Raving Rabbids, spawned a million sequels despite the original series being forgotten about. That is until Rayman Origins came along and revitalised it. And here we see a similar thing, but this time with the Spyro Reignited Trilogy being the game to bring back the series. Rather than talk about every little detail across all three games, what I'll be doing in this review is more so focusing on the changes the Reignited Trilogy makes to the originals. The reason for this is because the remakes are actually very similar to the original games in a lot of ways. So if you're interested in my full opinion across all three of the original games, you can just check out my previous videos that I did on the series. I'll put a link to them in the description for if you're interested. Being made a whole 20 years after the original game, the most obvious change that smacks you right in the chops as soon as the game begins is the obvious graphical upgrade. The Reignited Trilogy looks amazing, it's bright, cartoony, and the animations of Spyro and every enemy and NPC are absolute top quality. I literally couldn't have asked for a better remake in this area. Not only are the graphics obviously so much higher quality, but there's also more detail in the game's environments. Like for example in the level Dark Hollow, there's now a lot more bookcases scattered around the level, which just helps to stop the levels looking too bare and boxy. The character designs are all spot on too. With the original games having very low poly models, Toys for Bob had to take some creative liberties to bring the characters into HD. And for the most part, I think they did a really good job with this. The only characters that I thought missed the mark maybe a little bit were Handel and Greta and the Landblubber characters. Handel and Greta just look a little bit too humanoid rather than being cartoon characters with big oval heads, and I always saw the Landblubbers as being a bit cute. But in the Reignited Trilogy they look a little bit grotesque. I don't know, it just doesn't feel like they quite got the vibe right in these examples. I have to say as well, I'm still not sure about the dragons in Spyro 1 wearing clothes. The fact they're wearing clothes surely brings attention to the fact that Spyro isn't, meaning in this universe he's just running around naked all the time. I don't know, something about this just doesn't sit right with me. Still though, all of these things aside, the game looks incredible and no one can take that away from it. I've seen some people complain about the game running poorly, but for me the game ran really consistently and I never even noticed it drop a single frame. I'm thinking that maybe the game runs worse on a PS4 Pro and that's why people have been experiencing issues, but I played it on a standard PS4 and it ran perfectly, so I've got nothing to complain about in that area. You know, one thing that is a little bit annoying is that you need an update to be able to play Spyro 2 and 3. The game was delayed for quite a while as well, so the least I would have expected is to be able to have played the full trilogy right out of the box. And what about people that don't have internet connections? They're just screwed, unable to play Spyro 2 and 3 at all. The music for the Reignited Trilogy has been completely remade too, but uses the original soundtrack as a foundation and basically just builds on that. I have to say, a lot of the time the music sounds exactly the same as the original tracks anyway, but what makes me prefer the updated music is the fact that it's dynamic. This means that when you're stood still or walking around slowly, the music will be different to if you're charging around or in combat. It's one of those things you might not even notice because it feels so natural, but it was a really nice touch that I appreciated a lot. It gives the soundtrack a lot more depth, that's for sure. Not only does it change depending on if you're stood still or in combat, but it also changes when you're in different environments too. So for example, if you're in a tunnel, it will have more of an echo and become a bit muffled, but then when you exit the enclosed area, it will blast out again as usual. I honestly have no idea why anyone wouldn't like this about the soundtrack, or why anyone wouldn't prefer the remade music over the original, but if you are one of those people, the Reignited Trilogy has you covered, because you can go into the options menu and turn dynamic music off, or even use the original game's soundtrack completely unaltered. This is a really cool touch, and even though I didn't use this function, I still appreciate it being there. I actually kinda wish this was a feature in the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy, because I found that game's soundtrack to be worse than the originals at times. The sound design is really good too, although if I were to be nitpicky, I would say that the noise it makes when you collect a gem isn't as satisfying as it was back in the original. Some of the voice acting for me just straight up isn't nearly as good as the original game's voice acting either. I don't think this is a problem in Spyro 1 or 3, but in Spyro 2, some characters were actually kinda ruined by the voice not being right. Weirdly, the two main examples I have of this are from the same level, but still, give it a listen and tell me what you think.
My name is Little Bo Peep, and I've lost my cowlicks. With these battles going on all of the time, they keep running away.
My name is Little Bo Peep, and I have lost my cowlicks. With these battles going on all the time, they keep running away.
Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Oh, there's Romeo.
Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Oh, there's Romeo.
I always saw the original voices as being funny and over the top in a cartoonish way, which obviously works with the sort of game Spyro is. But in the remake, the voices just aren't funny or over the top at all, and it actually makes the level less memorable because of that. I did also have a little bit of a problem with Hunter's new voice. His character is actually quite different in the remake because of this. In the original, he came across to me as more clumsy and idiotic, but put on this facade of being cool and brave, which almost makes him look even more stupid when something goes wrong. But in the remake, he doesn't really give off the impression of being clumsy or idiotic anymore, which just leaves him being this kinda one-dimensional character with just a single personality trait. Every other character is perfectly representative of their original character, so it's odd that they seemingly consciously decided to change Hunter, and in my opinion it makes him a lot less likeable. There's also the fact that in Spyro 2, Spyro no longer seems like he doesn't want to be an Avalar at first, and rather it comes across like he wants to help Elora and the gang from the get-go, which kind of ruins what little character development the original game had. He was supposed to go from unwillingly helping out and just wanting to go on vacation to making friends with the new cast of characters and actively wanting to help them. But this doesn't really come across anymore. It's crazy that all of these changes to certain characters in the overall story have been made with just a change of voice acting, even though the script is exactly the same. It just goes to show exactly how important voice acting is. It can have such a massive impact on people's perceptions of the plot and characters. On the flip side though, the voice acting in Spyro 1 and 3 is much better, especially in 3 where I thought certain characters were annoying and stereotypical. In the remake, those same characters were a lot more tolerable and had slightly more character to them. I will say though that despite a voice being a bit better, the Sorceress is still a rubbish villain in my opinion. Agent 9 is actually okay now too, whereas he was a little bit too much in the original game for me.
Thanks, Spyro! Oh, say, you ever see a bear dance?
Woohoo! Yee-hee! I'm free!
Thanks, Spyro! Oh, say, you ever see a bear dance?
No?
But let's get down to the actual meat of the game, the gameplay. Well, to start with, the controls have obviously been updated to fully work with the analog sticks, and unlike with the N. Sane Trilogy where the analog control felt awkward to me, in the Reignited Trilogy it feels absolutely perfect. Spyro's controls are snappy and responsive, and you never feel like you have a lack of control over him. He has a little bit more weight to his jumping and gliding now, which took a little bit of getting used to, but after getting over that hurdle, everything was spot on. You can also control the camera with the right analog stick, which is great and gives you a lot more freedom than what you had in the original games. If you're completely stuck in the past though, you can change the controls to be the same as they were on the PS1, so the L2 and R2 buttons will rotate the camera. Although why anyone would do that, I've got no idea. You can also use R2 to breathe fire, but I guess I am partially stuck in the past because I stuck to using the circle button for that. You can also still use the D-pad to control Spyro 2, so there's quite a lot of different ways to play the game, which is always a good thing. So far, I would say this is a really good remake. The controls are better, the music's better, the graphics are better. The only thing that's objectively worse is the voice acting, and even then it's only with a handful of characters. Now let's talk about some of the stuff that's been added to the Reignited Trilogy, shall we? First of all, you now have Sparks' gem finding ability from the very start of all 3 games. With the originals, it wasn't there in the first game at all, it was there from the start of Spyro 2, and it was unlocked later on in the 3rd game. The fact that this is just given to you straight away is a very good decision, because it's just a very user-friendly ability to have. Let's face it, it's not fun running around a big open level looking for one last gem, is it? So now you can just have Sparks point straight to a gem if you've missed one. This is great as well because I actually found the gems to be a lot more difficult to spot in the remakes. This is probably because of the more detailed graphics making them blend in a little bit more, and the fact that grassy levels can obstruct gems because the grass actually sticks out of the floor, unlike in the original games. This obviously would be a massive problem, but because Sparks can just point you to a gem even if it's somewhat hidden by the environment, I don't think it matters. Skill points have been added into Spyro 1 as well, which is an amazing change. Skill points were these hidden objectives that you could do in some levels in Spyro 2 and 3, but now Toys for Bob have created brand new ones for Spyro 1 to bring it more in line with the sequels. This is particularly good because there's no objectives given to you in Spyro 1 besides simply collecting everything, so to have some sort of other task is a great change. I will say though, I do wish they had gone a lot further with this. Not only do I think they should have added more skill points into Spyro 2 and 3, the ones in those games are the same ones that were in the original games, but I think they should have added in an orb or dragon egg style collectible into Spyro 1. This would have drastically changed the way Spyro 1 plays, and I know a hell of a lot of people probably wouldn't want it to be changed. But for me personally, I think some new objectives and minigame style sections in Spyro 1 could have been incredible. It would make it a better game if it was well thought out and well implemented, and it's a bit of a shame they stopped at the skill points if you ask me. Imagine playing Spyro 1 but coming across brand new NPCs who give you challenges you've never done there before. It would have given the remake even more value than it already has, because there's something brand new even for veterans of the series. You know what hasn't been added into the remakes? Intro and outro cutscenes for the levels in Spyro 1 and 3. I absolutely love these in Spyro 2, and they could have given the same treatment to all 3 games across the entire trilogy to really make every level stand apart. I mean, especially in Spyro 3. They could have come up with new skits involving the characters of those worlds. Going back to the skill points for a second, one of my only complaints about Spyro 2 was that you couldn't see a list of the skill points before actually completing them, basically resulting in you having to use a guide to help you. In the remake though, the skill points can be seen right from the start of the game, which is a damn good change. However, do you remember my only other criticism of the game? There's a section in the level Fracture Hills where you help an alchemist to free Hunter from his concrete boots. However, after doing this mission, Hunter will give you another task to help him defeat the enemies in the area. The catch is, you can't do this until you learn the head bash move later in the game, which results in you needing to backtrack to this level later. No big deal, right? You have to backtrack to other levels in the game after getting new abilities, so why am I making a fuss? Well, the difference here is that you need to go through the Alchemist mission all over again, rather than just being able to go straight to Hunter's mission. And the Alchemist mission can be very irritating to get through because it's basically an escort mission where the enemies attack extremely quickly. And the Alchemist himself dupes you by turning on the spot and taking the most indirect route imaginable. So what do you think the remake did to fix this? You would think they would have just have made Hunter's mission available upon re-entering the level if you've already done the Alchemist's mission. But no. The remake does nothing to fix this issue, and you'll still find yourself having to pointlessly replay the Alchemist mission if you didn't know you'd need the head bash move afterwards. I really wish they would have fixed this. It would have made Spyro 2 almost perfect by eradicating the only two major issues I had with it. But still, I guess one out of the two problems is fine. Despite me loving the remakes in a lot of ways, I did also have several problems while playing through it. So, let's quickly go through some of my issues with the game, shall we? The loading times are a bit annoying. It can take slightly too long to get into a level, and the loading screen when you launch one of the 3 games is particularly long. It's not as bad as the load times that the Insane Trilogy had before its update, but it still could do with cutting down a bit. I kind of expected them to put Spyro's hover move into Spyro 1, and I don't think this would have broken the game in the slightest to have it implemented. It's nice having that extra degree of control and would have helped with some of the harder platforming sections. Spyro 1 features some of the hardest platforming in the trilogy, so I think they probably should have put it in there. It would have unified the trilogy a little bit more, which they've done in other ways, such as adding skill points into Spyro 1 and by adding the ability to properly charge and jump at the same time into Spyro 1. So why not add the hover? I also expected the flying levels featured in all 3 games to have online leaderboards. It would have been perfect for this. You could have competed with friends to see who can do the course in the fastest time. But oddly, there's no online functionality at all in the Reignited Trilogy. I didn't experience any bugs or technical issues while playing through the trilogy, and I know a lot of people have. But there was this one thing in Spyro 3 in the last hub world where this whirligig didn't work if I jumped into it, despite every other one across all 3 games working even if you jumped into them. So I guess that's the closest thing I found to a bug with the game, but even then it was easy to get around. I just had to walk into it rather than jump and it worked fine. Just a bit of a weird issue that I assume will be fixed at some point soon if other people have experienced it. When Spyro jumps off of a hot air balloon in Spyro 1, there's no animation and he's kinda just lifted out of the balloon and placed onto the ground by an unseen force, and it really threw me off when I first saw it. Because in every other situation there's a great attention to detail with the animations, so I don't know what's going on there. Speaking of attention to detail, remember in my Spyro 1 video how I said it's really cool how each hub world has its own flag design, and this is something a lot of people might not have ever even noticed? Well, yeah, apparently Toys for Bob didn't notice this either because the hub world flags are now just a solid colour with no actual design on them, which is a bit of a bummer. Do you remember the crazy monk character from Spyro 2 that started going off script talking about killing?
Even though I'm a vegetarian, I think you should kill that Yeti.
Well, yeah, in the 20 years leading up to the remake, he seems to have calmed down quite a bit because he sticks to the script and no longer goes off the rails. So that's a nice change, I suppose.
Even though I'm a vegetarian, I think you should torch that Yeti.
Remember how when you finished a level in the original games you would get to see all of the gems you collected fly from Spyro to a treasure chest while the next level loaded? Well, that doesn't happen in the Reignited Trilogy, and instead you just see a number count up, which is nowhere near as satisfying. This is a really nitpicky complaint, but I don't like the text used for the majority of the Reignited Trilogy. In the original trilogy, the text for the gem totals and other things was 3D and moved slightly, which almost made it feel like a part of the game world. However, in the remakes, the text is just a standard 2D font, and it just looks boring by comparison. The game's title screens and credit sequences are nowhere near as good as they were in the originals. Remember how each title screen for the original games had a little cutscene featuring the Insomniac Games logo, and how the credits for all 3 of the games had the camera fly through loads of levels from the game while the credits appeared and disappeared? Well, now, the title screens are replaced by this boring game select menu which has no character to it at all, and the credits screen is just a standard roll of text too. I mean, it does feature some art for the game, but it's still not of the same calibre of quality as the original games. There's a very specific aspect of the sound design that I don't like, and it's the drumming that happens whenever Spyro goes into a charge. It's quite subtle, but when I noticed it, I couldn't stop hearing it, and I would have much rather have just heard Spyro's feet rather than this constant tapping of a drum on top of that. You can't invert the aiming controls specifically, which is probably a really oddly specific issue to have with the game. But I'm pretty sure that when you went into the look mode in the original games, the camera movement controls were inverted. But in the Reignited Trilogy, these controls are normal and can't be inverted, which threw me off pretty much every single time I used this function. Just because of how unnatural it feels because of how many times I've played the original games. The bonuses for completing each of the games are exactly the same as they were back in the original games, meaning that Spyro 2 is the only game with a good completion bonus in the form of the infinite super flame power-up, while Spyro 1 and 3 simply have a secret level. I feel like this is very inconsistent between the three games, and what probably should have happened was that you got the super flame power-up in all three games for getting 100%. I don't know, this just felt a little bit weird to me. Speaking of inconsistency, there's some really inconsistent tutorials throughout the three games, which would have been a difficult thing to fix, but it was still a little bit jarring. What I mean by this is that you can have gotten 100% on Spyro 1 and 2, then start 3 and be reminded how to use the hover ability and that you have to charge small enemies and flame big enemies, as if you didn't already know that. There's also a bit of an issue where, because they've been so faithful to the original games, there's functions that you outright aren't told about in Spyro 1. Like the differences between active and passive camera modes, but you're told about them at the very start of Spyro 2 and 3. I don't like how there's an orb icon that floats above NPCs' heads in Spyro 2, it just looks a bit ugly and it's a bit immersion breaking too. What makes this weirder though is that there's no egg icon floating above the NPCs in Spyro 3, so why is it there in the second game? In Spyro 3, because the levels are separated into one main level and then several separate sub-levels, I really feel like there should have been a notification when you've gotten everything in the area you're in, rather than it just telling you when you've got 100% in the entire level. It just would be nice to have the information that you don't need to be running around the sub-area that you're in anymore, and you can just move on to the main level again, or vice versa. This was an issue I had with the original game, but I really thought they would have fixed this in the remake. Probably one of the biggest issues I had with the game though is the way that you can't see what's underwater when you're on the surface anymore. So this means when you dive, there's a moment where you're left not being able to see because Spyro is underwater but the camera is still above the surface. It's just weird because surely this would have been an issue brought up during the testing. It's so obvious and you would think it would be easy to fix too, just make it so that you can see underwater before you dive in. Yeah, I had quite a lot of issues while playing through the Reignited Trilogy, but let's be honest, a hell of a lot of those issues were really minor, and you would probably only notice them if you were a hardcore fan of the original games. That being said, it would be nice if some of those things could be ironed out with an update. Anyway, after that rant, let's now talk about some of the things that I did like about the Reignited Trilogy. First of all, the cutscene quality is much higher, not just because the graphics are better and the animations are way more expressive, but because they actually make certain elements of the story a bit more clear. Like how in the very first cutscene of the first game, we now actually see that Nasty Nook is watching the interview take place on a TV. Whereas in the original, this was implied but never actually shown on screen. The issue with the first cutscene in Spyro 3 where the sound design was practically non-existent is fixed now too, and I specifically said in my review of the original game that it feels like someone should shout after her at one point, but there's no dialogue at all. Well, in the remake they literally did exactly that and added in pretty much that exact bit of dialogue.
Huh? Get her! Stop her!
The trophies, or achievements if you're playing on Xbox, are actually really good throughout the Reignited Trilogy, and instead of just being given to you for getting 100% within the game, they basically act more so as alternative skill points and are rewarded to you for doing something more specific within a level, like using a cannon to blow up a Nook that's taunting you in Peacekeepers, and things like that. If this game was ever put on the Switch, it would actually be missing some content because of its lack of a trophy equivalent. The one negative thing about this is that in order to see the trophy objectives, you have to leave the game and go onto the PlayStation trophy screen, which breaks the flow of the game quite a bit. Perhaps the trophy objectives should have been listed within the game itself like the skill points are, so it was quicker and easier to check them throughout the adventure. Just like Sparks' gem finding ability, you now have the option of fast travelling to any previously visited level by opening the guidebook and just selecting the level you want. This was unlocked right at the end of Spyro 3 in the original trilogy and was absent from Spyro 1 and 2 completely, so to have it from the start of all 3 games is pretty cool. In the original version of Spyro 2 and 3, you could unlock a gallery where you could read about what happened after the events of the game by getting all of the skill points. In the Reignited Trilogy, getting these skill points unlocks an art gallery where you can look at some concept art used during the game's development. This is pretty cool, but I would probably say it's not quite as good as the reward from the original games. What is good though is that you can look at the art gallery from the main menu, which combines all of the art you've unlocked throughout all 3 games in one place. You know what, one positive thing I was going to say is that the weird thing where they changed Handel's voice going from Spyro 2 to 3 had been fixed. But actually, there are 2 specific instances where he still uses W's instead of R's, which Greta is supposed to do.
You'll have to take the long way around through these Rhinox to get to it. Remember, press the attack button to shoot, and use the roll left and roll right buttons to dodge left and right.
The thing that I really don't get about this is that for the most part they made him speak normally like he does in Spyro 2, but it's like they just forgot to change the script for these 2 tiny sections. It's just annoying because this was the perfect opportunity to make his speech consistent, and they ruined it. My biggest overall issue with the Spyro Reignited Trilogy is that I feel like they played it safe and was really faithful to the original games and didn't make enough changes to it. Don't get me wrong, they did make quite a lot of minor changes which are mostly all incredible, like the inclusion of skill points in Spyro 1. But pretty much all of the really big issues I had with the original trilogy are still present in the remakes. So Spyro 1 still has an issue with its collectibles all being used for the same purpose, not having objective-based gameplay, and the bosses being really poor. Spyro 2 still has that one issue with backtracking that I mentioned earlier, and Spyro 3 still has issues with a lot of the playable characters being boring, the bosses being bad, the story being underdeveloped, and the overall game being a little bit too long for its own good. Basically, this is just the same games, flaws and all, on the PS4. Now, I guess the positive thing about this is that because of the graphical upgrade, the inclusion of skill points and trophies, the update to the controls, the new dynamic soundtrack, and having fast travel and the gem finding ability from the start of all 3 games, the Reignited Trilogy is the definitive way of playing all 3 of the original Spyro games. I don't normally say that about remakes, but here, it's not really possible for me to argue the originals are better. There are aspects of the originals that I prefer, like certain character designs and voices, but most of the new changes do nothing but improve the original experience. I just find myself wishing they would have added in a few more new features and maybe been a bit braver with changing certain elements too. Like maybe building up the bosses in Spyro 1 a little bit more by adding in new cutscenes or something. But having said that, it's hard to be disappointed when essentially what we have here is a better version of one of my favourite game series ever. I'm giving the Spyro Reignited Trilogy an 8 out of 10. It's the ultimate version of the Spyro trilogy, but what stops it from getting a 9 or a 10 is the fact that it's still flawed by the same problems that the original trilogy had. Considering how much I like the original games though, this really isn't too much of a big deal, and because of how good the games are generally, these flaws are incredibly easy to look past. I extremely highly recommend this game to anyone who's a fan of platformers, and of course anyone who's a fan of Spyro. But let's be honest, any fan of Spyro already has this anyway. After the Insane trilogy, I was actually going into the Reignited trilogy with a little bit of trepidation. Despite liking the Insane trilogy, I don't think it's the definitive experience, and I would rather play the PS1 originals over this. So I'm happy to say that with the Reignited Trilogy, it's become my go-to way of playing the original Spyro games, and hopefully it'll be made even better with future DLC and updates. It just makes me excited to think about what's going to happen to Spyro in the future. Thanks for watching! What do you think to the Spyro Reignited Trilogy? Do you think it's the definitive version of the games? Have you encountered any bugs or glitches that put you off? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye!